what I want to do tonight is move into beyond the sins which we've looked at. And last time we were looking at chapters 56 and 58, but tonight I want to look, howbeit briefly, at some hope passages, because we can get stuck in kind of justice themes and condemnation and judgment. And we have to begin there, and that's all very legitimate. But the prophets never stay there. They always are looking beyond the sin and the judgment that it will generate from God. And so tonight, just to spend some time in the hope passages in Isaiah. Now, I don't know how far we'll get, or if at the end I'll just move very quickly. So I'm just going to watch the time and then see how we handle it. In the previous studies, 1 and 2, we looked at those passages, Isaiah 1 and 2, chapter 5, and then last time 56 and 58. Today I want to look at 9, 11, and a series of sermon passages in the second part of Isaiah. But I want us to have some takeaways. The thing about these Bible studies is that there's so many details, and we're just kind of scratching the surface in so many ways. So there's some takeaways from these hope passages that I think are important. The first one, and this is crucial, is that when you go to the prophets, the future is a reversal of the present. So if the present is hunger and thirst, if the present is unjust government, if the present is war, if the present is an oppressive society, what the prophets will present us as the future is the reversal of all this. So instead of hunger and thirst, there'll be plenty. Instead of a corrupt government, there'll be a just king. Instead of war, there'll be peace. Instead of an oppressive society, what you'll get is one over which Messiah will rule in justice. So it's a reversal. And I think this should inspire confidence that what we do actually matters and that one day all of this will be made right. Okay? So reversal, that's a key takeaway. This is all going to end and it's going to flip in God's timing. The second thing is that these prophets, they're looking forward and they're describing the future which hasn't come yet. And I think the idea there is that this should give us an anticipation of the future, and it should energize us, because as we're involved in the things that so many of you are involved in, you're actually providing a taste of the future in what you do. You're participating in the future in what you do. And it matters because it's pointing the way forward. Now, the thing that we know that they did not know was that Messiah has come. And so, in a sense, his kingdom has been inaugurated. And so, in a very real way, as we get involved in these things, we're bringing the future into the present, even as we look to the fullness of the future, which lies ahead. And hopefully, that should be an encouragement. It should energize you and just add another layer of significance to what you do. Now, sometimes in evangelical circles, I know the one I came to faith in years ago in college, there was a lot of interest in prophecy, but it was prophecy of the more sensationalistic sort. And that's been around in the church and even before the church among certain Jewish groups. Trying to figure out, when Jesus would come, and what that would be like. And so you'd get a lot of movies and books about the second coming. And I can appreciate that from a human point of view, but it doesn't really fit what the prophets are trying to do. because they don't know when it's coming. They have no idea. Either the judgment that what they're doing now will be sent to do, but after the judgment, they just know there's a judgment coming and it's soon. But beyond the judgment, there is the restoration. So, but they have no idea of the time. They have no idea of the who. You know, we can talk about, oh, they're looking for a Messiah, but they have no idea who that's going to be. And they have no idea when he will come. And then when they talk about the restoration of the kingdom and of the earth, they don't know how long that will last, you see. So, but those are the kind of things that people have always been interested in. You know, I used to have a book. I'm not sure if I shared this in another gathering, but I used to have a book, and all the moves we've made over the last few years, it got lost, or maybe in a moment of obtuseness and stupidity, I gave it away. But it was written by a man who had been an editor, I think, for Time magazine. So, but it wasn't a Christian book. But the title was very intriguing because the title was The End of the World, and then the subtitle was A History. And the idea was looking at all the times when people thought it was the end of the world. For instance, the Black Plague, where something like, 20-30% of Europe died. I mean, that was the end of the world as they knew it. When we were in Sheffield in the UK years ago, there was a village not too far from that city where the people, the plague had hit the town, and the people quarantined themselves, most of them to their death, so that the plague would not spread beyond the village. I mean, that's amazing stuff. But it was the end of the world as they knew it. World War I, that was the end of the world. World War II, a level of conflict that we have never seen in our lifetime. And so you could go on and on and on about the end of the world. And it's interesting that when the disciples asked Jesus, when is the end coming? He doesn't give them anything concrete. He just says, well, there'll be earthquakes and rumors of war. And that's not very helpful because that happens all the time. So I think because we see those things, we think this is that. And one last thing before I move on. In the Old Testament, when it talks about the future and the judgment that's coming, and I may have mentioned this before, it uses the metaphor of a woman in birth pangs, where you get contractions and at a certain rhythm, but as the end comes closer, the contractions come faster and faster, you see, until the final push and the final pain. And that's a good way of looking at this kind of thing, because the patterns persist. That's why people keep thinking it's the end of the world, because they're seeing the pattern. But they're confusing the pattern with the end. And that's where the metaphor of the birth pangs, I think, is helpful. So let me stop there just for a second. Have any of you kind of had some of these ideas thrown out to you about the world, end of the world, or, the idea is that the end of the world really isn't important. What's really important is what we're doing now. Have any of you had that kind of experience?
Well, I do live in Austin, an hour and a half from Waco. So there is that particular history.
Yeah.
I grew up in a similar, very a lot about end times and even charts. Like there were lots of charts about how it would all go down. But then also in some ways, in a very kind of catastrophic right before the end, and then also in a world that in a church idea that really it's after the end of the world, that matters. And really, we just need to wait till the end. A lot of ideas about heaven, a lot about the future, and almost a disassociation with the presence. So that's my experience with sort of that, the timeline of the history of the world. Mary, I don't know what your experience has been.
I grew up with all the t-shirts, all the rapture stuff talking about that, and it was very much kind of save as many souls as possible before it all burns. But in the last 15 years or so, I've had people around me who've taught me different eschatology, and one that is a little bit more biblical, I think, and talking more about sort of the wheat and the chaff, and that things will be separated in the end, and that we can contribute to what lasts, kind of like just like what you were saying, Danny, that so you said we're bringing the future into the present, and that's a hopeful thing to think about, so that it's helpful. I'm relearning.
Yeah, my impression has been that because there was, and I'm a lot older than a lot of people here, I think some of that excitement or focus was kind of a previous generation. And what I've seen in the last 20 years or so is a reaction against it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reaction, as reactions tend to do, may have swung too far.
Mm.
And so people they don't even talk about eschatology, the study of the end of the world, or they say these things don't really matter. Let's don't argue about it. And it's really a reaction, which is just avoiding the issues. But I think something you said just triggered this idea too, and maybe Christine, what you were saying. If the future, which I think it is in the Old Testament, is the reversal of the present, that means it is inescapably connected to and relevant for the present. Okay. So you cannot understand the future unless you understand the present. And you can't understand the present unless you can appreciate the future. So it's very relevant. So when you look at what the prophets are doing, they're not trying to give people any eschatological charts. They can't give them any kind of timeline. And so their visions of the future are actually geared to somehow stimulating them to do things in the present. Now, that stimulation can be of two kinds. Because part of the future is a coming judgment, the message of the future stands as a warning to the present. See, this is why when you read a great example of this would be the book of Jeremiah, where he uses this Hebrew word shuv over and over again, more than any other prophet. And in Hebrew, the idea of repenting, this idea of shuv, is actually to turn and to turn around. Sometimes you'll hear sermons about repentance is changing your mind. Okay. Well, that's the Greek word, but in the Old Testament, that's not what it is. It's actually to change your path, to turn around or go in a different direction based on what is coming, which is, in the case of Jeremiah, the judgment and ultimately the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the nation of Judah. So the future stands as a warning. See? So it's intimately related to the present. But the future also is about hope. And so if you are going to go through the judgment, whether you deserved it or not, you may not deserve it, but you live in a people or among a people that deserves it as a nation, it gives you hope. And the hope helps you persevere because you can imagine a different future beyond what we live now and beyond the judgment that it will incur. Okay, let's look at a few passages. And you can see there that the way I set it up is about setting the stage. Because again, because it's connected to the present, let's just rehearse some of the things about the present, and then the future will make sense. So here's some passages that I know we looked at some of them last time, but if everyone has their Bible, if you go to Isaiah chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, it says, "Wash and make yourselves clean, take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow." That's what's going on now. Verse 23, "Your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves. They all love bribes and they chase after gifts. They do not defend the cause of the fatherless. The widow's case does not come before them." And then verse 26, after he's called the city, if you go back up to verse 21, see how the faithful city has become a prostitute or a whore. If you go to verse 26, "I will restore your leaders as in days of old, your rulers as at the beginning. Afterward, you'll be called the city of righteousness and the faithful city." And so that hope of the city changing into a city of hope is in contrast to what they live now, where the city is like a prostitute and its leaders are corrupt to the core and the vulnerable are just cast aside. If you go to 3:14, well, let's begin in 13. "The Lord takes his place in court. He rises to judge the people. The Lord enters into judgment against the elders and leaders of his people. It is you who have ruined my vineyard. The plunder from the poor is in your houses." What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the face of the poor? So this is the present in which they live, and this is what God will judge them for. If we go to 5, chapter 5, as we talked about last time, is full of the woes against the sins of Judah and of Jerusalem. But in 5:16, it says, "But the Lord Almighty, Yahweh Sabaoth, will be exalted by his justice, and the holy God will be proved holy by his righteous acts." So you're getting this contrast between just how bad things are and the cancerous society that it is. And then what happens, when you move then into what comes after these woes of chapter 5, the first thing you get in chapter 6, verse 1, is a vision of the divine king. And it begins with the declaration that King Uzziah has died. Uzziah had been on the throne of Judah for decades. And at the end, well, he doesn't end well. But in the end of his life, what we have is a vision of the Lord in his temple and exalted and seated on a throne. Now, the thing that in Hebrew, there's a word, hekal, which is the word for palace and the word for temple in Hebrew are the same word. So the temple in Jerusalem is actually the palace of the Lord. And the seat of atonement and all this kind of things that upon which God dwells is actually his throne. So he is sitting on his throne in the Holy of Holies in his palace. That's the vision that you have. And then you have all the angels around him praising him. And then, of course, singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty." So the contrast between what the city is and who God is, the divine king and all of his holiness and power, who will decree judgment. And you know how it goes in this chapter, where he goes, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" Now in the passage, the us are the other angels. "Whom will I send? And who's going to go for all of us?" Okay? All the angels. And they're flying. If you read the passage, they're ready to go. They just need the command to go. But he's saying, no, you're not going. Who's going to go for us? And the only other person on the scene is Isaiah. So it's actually a direct challenge to him. Are you going to take up the gauntlet or not? And he does. But then he will go, after God says, I'll give you this message where their heart will be calloused, their eyes cannot see, their ears cannot hear. And then he asks the question in verse 11 that all of us would ask if we were given that kind of call: for how long? And the reply is, until the war is over, until the judgment is done. So what you're getting is the judgment of a divine king, in contrast to all the corruption, the bribery, and the oppression coming from the places of power in Jerusalem. And when you move into chapter 10, you've got another king, not King Uzziah, he's dead, but the King Ahaz. And Ahaz, I won't go into all the details of the history, but he has already compromised the state of Judah with the Assyrian Empire to stay on the throne, to keep his power, at least some semblance of it. And the prophet comes, God had told him to go to Ahaz, and beginning in verse 10, he says, ask me anything that you will, and I'll give it to you. I just want to show you that I am with you. And so, verse 12, in a pious hypocrisy, he goes, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. Well, from other sources, we know that he's already made an agreement with the Assyrians, basically to turn his country over into a vassal state of the empire. And the response is, okay, if you don't want a sign, I'll give you a sign. And the sign, beginning in verse 14, is that the young maiden will conceive and give birth to a son, and his name will be Emmanuel. So what you're seeing is present circumstances, the contrast with the divine king, present circumstances of a corrupt, conniving king trying to save his own throne. And now what will come is a child, Emmanuel. And Emmanuel is all we know, as we all know from Christmas, means God with us. In Hebrew, the im is a preposition with. Anu would be the suffix for us, and el is God. So with us, God, Emmanuel. So with us, God. This is the name of the child. But as you go through these passages here, the question that everyone has asked now for over 2,000 years is, well, who is this Emmanuel, and when's he coming? And they'll jump to Matthew chapter 1 with Jesus. But we're not in Matthew. We're in Isaiah, hundreds of years beforehand. And I won't go into all the details, but there is a child that appears in chapter 8, and it's the child of the prophet. And in chapter 8, Emmanuel actually appears twice, if you were to read it. And he and his sons are called a sign. So one thing you might ask yourself, is the son of the prophet this child? The vocabulary is too close in chapter 8. But as you move into chapter 9, what you see is that this is a divine child. It's a royal child. The divine is more hinted at, but there is no doubt that it's a royal child. So when you move into chapter 9, and I need to go back to the Assyrian king in just a moment, you will see that it's a royal child, and therefore it disqualifies the child of the prophet. And you're still left wondering, so who is this Emmanuel? And we'll get back to that in a little bit. But the other king that's on the scene, so you have the divine king, you've got this bad king from Judah, and then also in chapter 8, you have the Assyrian king. And look how the king is described. The Lord is about to bring against them the mighty floodwaters of the Euphrates, the king of Assyria with all his pomp. It will overflow its channels. run over all its banks, and sweep into Judah, swirling over it, passing through it, and reaching up to the neck. A description of the invasion. It's like a flood. Its outspread wings will cover the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. So you have all these contrasts going on. And this is where you have the vision of the royal child in chapter 9. So let's look at that passage. And again, it's the idea of contrast. And let's begin in verse 2. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. Now, if you were, we won't have time, but if you were to go back to the last part of chapter 8, it talks about the people are in darkness. And so he says, those who are in darkness have seen a great light. You've enlarged the nation, increased their joy. Verse 3, they rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest. These are peasants, and the harvest is a time of rejoicing, is a time of celebration. As warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder, for as in the days of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them. See this idea that the invasion is coming. The bar across their shoulders, the rod of the oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning with fuel, will be fuel for the fire, the end of war. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. A child, a royal child, a king. See? And then he begins to describe the king as wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. And he will be on David's throne and over his kingdom everlasting, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. But look at the descriptions of the person: counselor, mighty, everlasting, Prince of Peace, justice, righteousness. See, all these things will come with that king versus what they experience now. Now, if you were to look at any country in the world, but let's just talk about American politics at this point, we have an election coming up in November. And the politics of this country are so incredibly corrupt. I'm talking both parties to the core. The lying, the positioning, the buying and selling of votes, the corruption at all levels of government, you see. People posturing for power, selling their souls. I mean, this is what politics is like and always been like. People suffering as a result of this. I mean, in the international repercussions, issues with the border, and so the funding to Ukraine is stopped. And so, what does that mean? It means the Ukrainians are getting bombed; they can't respond. I mean, it just ripples. And in this country, because of our stature, it ripples across the world. So this is the hope. In contrast to what we live today, in contrast to the leadership that we have, in contrast to all of that, there is a king who will come. Now, when Isaiah says these words, he has no idea who this is going to be, and no idea when it will come. But the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Let me go to the next passage. And again, I'm looking at the clock here. I'm not sure how far we can go, but we'll see. In chapter 10, he describes the arrogance of the Assyrian king. Chapter 10, verse 12 through 19. And maybe one of you can read it just so I don't have to talk too much. Verses 12 through 19. One of you can do that?
When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the arrogant boasting of the king of Assyria and his haughty pride. For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding. I have removed the boundaries of peoples and have plundered their treasures. Like a bull, I have brought down those who sat on thrones. My hand has found, like a nest, the wealth of the peoples, and as one gathers eggs that have been forsaken, so I have gathered all the earth. and there was none that moved a wing, or opened its mouth, or chirped. Shall the axe vaunt itself over the one who wields it, or shall the saw magnify itself against the one who handles it? As if a rod should raise the one who lifts it up, or as if a staff should lift the one who's not wood. Therefore, the sovereign, the Lord of hosts, will send wasting sickness among his stout warriors, and under his glory a burning will be kindled, like the burning of fire. The light of Israel will become a fire, and his Holy One a flame, and it will burn and devour his thorns and briars in one day. The glory of his forest and his fruitful land, the glory of his forest and his fruitful land, the Lord will destroy, both soul and body, and it will be as when an invalid wastes away. The remnant of the trees of his forest will be so few that a child can write them down.
Okay, just that part. The arrogance of this Assyrian king, and if you go into the ancient world, this was the mightiest empire of the world until that time. The Assyrian Empire stretched all the way from modern Iraq into what we now call Turkey, into all the Fertile Crescent, and all the way into Egypt. It's a massive empire. And this king is going, didn't I plunder all the treasures of these nations? You know, who can stop me? And we won't look at it because of time, but if you look at when the Assyrian armies surround Jerusalem and they're taunting Jerusalem, this is in Isaiah 36 and 37. This is what he says. What other gods of the nations have been able to stop our armies? And the answer is none. In fact, he lists several other gods of other peoples. So what makes you think your God can stop me? The other gods haven't stopped me. This is the arrogance. And we actually have their account of their invasion of Judah. And what he will say, Sennacherib, of the siege of Jerusalem, he says, I had Hezekiah like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem. That's how he describes it. And if you go to verses 33 and 34, there's a metaphor here that we won't have time to develop, but in the book of Isaiah, you get the metaphor of trees and nations as trees. And so what he will say is, we will cut down this tree, the trees, the forest that is Assyria. Verse 33, see the Lord Almighty, Yahweh Sabaoth, will lop off the boughs with great power. The lofty trees will be felled. The tall ones will be brought low. See, there it is. He will cut down the forest thickets with an axe. Lebanon will fall before the mighty one. So the forests, the mighty trees that represent Assyria are being cut down. But look at the contrast that begins in chapter 11. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Now, that tree's been cut. Now, where do we see that? Go back to chapter 6, if you have your Bible. And I want you to see the closing line of chapter 6, the closing verse. This is when Isaiah is saying, how long? And the Lord says, until a tenth remains in the land, it will again be laid waste and leave stumps where they are cut down. So the holy seed will be the stump in the land. Judah will be cut down. The tree that's Judah will be cut down. But look at the contrast in chapter 11, verse 1. Out of the stump will come a branch. You see, so the cutting of Assyria is final. But out of the stump of the cutting down of Judah, out of that stump will come the future hope. And it's a king. So you have this contrast between this arrogant king of chapter 10 of the mightiest empire in the world and the king that will come out of the stump that is Judah. A shoot will come from the stump of Jesse, and from his roots a branch will bear fruit. And look at how different this king is. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the spirit of the knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears. We could use some of that today. But with righteousness, he will judge the needy. With justice, he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips, he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. What a contrast to the emperor, the mighty king of Assyria, and all of his arrogance will come a spirit-filled king. Now, once again, you have no idea who this king will be. But what a contrast, not only with Assyria, but also with the kings of Judah. Full of the Spirit, full of wisdom, full of justice, and willing to judge those who are evil. But this reversal also is going to move beyond the government and society. Now, part of this you have to appreciate what would happen in ancient warfare. In ancient warfare, armies would march in springtime because in springtime you have harvest. And if you have tens of thousands of soldiers like the Assyrians would have had, you have to feed them. How do you feed an army of tens of thousands? Well, you don't have transport planes. You eat off the land. And so that's why you go in springtime. In fact, when David has his sin with Bathsheba, the story begins in the springtime when kings go off to war. That's how it begins, that chapter, 2 Samuel 11. And if you know your ancient history, that makes sense. That's why they march in the spring. It's kind of like what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. Winter in Ukraine is very wet and cold, so everything bogs down and everything becomes kind of swampy and the armies just can't move. It's the same idea, except you're marching in springtime because there's food. So when a massive army like the Assyrians are marching across the land, it's like a plague of locusts. They don't leave much. The other thing that happens, the Assyrians would do as punishment of cities that had rebelled against them or that they were conquering, they would sow the land with salt to make it useless for growing food. They would cut down the fruit trees because it would take years for the fruit trees to grow back and to begin to give their fruit again. And so not only would they go like an army of locusts across the land, the devastation that they would leave behind them, let alone the burning of the forests and things like this, would have been massive. But when this future king comes, not only does he come in peace and wisdom and justice, look at the scene that you have described beginning in verse 6 of chapter 11. The wolf will lie with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. See, predators lying next to animals they normally eat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear instead of being eaten by the bear. The young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. Now that is very different. The infant will play near the cobra's den. The young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the water covers the sea. So again, contrast. Instead of war and corruption, peace. Peace and abundance, and not only peace in terms of no more war, but all the things that would have gone with war in the ancient world now have been taken away. And all of creation is living the abundance and the glories of the Lord, both human and non-human alike.